Thank you. Okay, so sorry about that. And so we wanted to ask why. And the way to get at that, we felt, is to do a research project that did a lot of field work and a survey of franchisees to get at how different franchisors treat franchisees different. So we could look at their legal requirements and then try to leverage what we could learn from that. And so the focus of today is to talk about how franchisor control or power over franchisees shapes the HR practices, AKA labor practices of the franchisees, and through what mechanisms. And so then the papers are very much work in progress. And I'm going to start with, I'm doing a little bit of a switch because of the way that the papers stack up. I'm going to report on the work of Ken Ouyang, so I'm going to share the screen. He is a grad student of mine. He wrote his dissertation on this, and I'm helping him, but he's in China and it's 3 in the morning or 2 in the morning. So I'm going to present his paper. And so I'm going to get started sharing. And can everyone see this? Yes? Okay. So, and I'm going to try to stick very strictly to some time limits and go from here. So the question is, how does the growth of franchise chains affect franchisees' investment in HR practices, labor practices? And here we want to know about franchisors' business strategy. So just to remind folks, the business model is the franchisor grants franchisees the rights to use the brand name and a standardized set of procedures, and the franchisee pays a lump sum fee and ongoing royalties on gross sales and retains the residual profits. So what we want to know is, if you take the franchisor's kind of business strategy of growth, that's kind of a basic macro question, how does that affect franchisees' investments in HR or for frontline workers, and why? And the second part is, can they use, or how do they use their enforcement policies, the threat of termination, for example, to affect franchise investments in the HR practices? Okay, so the argument goes like this: companies expand and use franchising to expand rapidly than they otherwise could. The faster they expand, the faster the revenues grow. However, this causes problems for them in terms of monitoring and control of their units. And so there are implications for labor. The two alternative theories are, one, because they're bigger systems and they grow faster, it's more difficult to monitor them, right? So they are likely to push franchisees to adopt more standardized practices in order to have better control. The second is that the larger systems, they grow, they can't monitor, and the franchisees simply do what they want. They kind of free ride on the brand. And then we also, as I said, want to look at then, is there a way in which franchisors use their threat of contract termination to enforce or shape what franchisees do? There are two types of practices that Tosh, who's in the room, and Ken developed in another paper. One is to think about practices that do not threaten the joint employer status. So that would be what is often called skill enhancing, things like selection and training. And then arguably those are legitimate because they improve the operational performance or the way that operational procedures are used. And the second is, practices that do threaten joint employer status, so motivational, like pay, benefits, and employment status. And here you would say there's not much of an argument for why pay should actually lead to better operational control, although you could make an argument it's motivational. Okay, so here's our little model, franchisee business strategy, brand strategy. should affect franchisees' investment. And we're going to look at these various measures of growth and their impact here, and then whether this threat of enforcement plays a role. So here is our data. So we match data from an archive of coded characteristics from franchisor disclosure documents. These are legally required to be made public. And so we gained access to research firm that has coded them. And we matched that. We took a national random sample of the franchisees in this archival database and surveyed them. And we limited it to 159 brands based on, getting rid of food trucks and mom and pops in rural areas. And then our measures, as I said, so franchise growth, the proportion of new units added to the system. So that's a growth rate. We also, I'll show you, looked at size and age of both the franchisor and the franchisee, and franchisor enforcement mechanisms, and then investment in these HR practices by the franchisee. Okay, and then I'm just going to give you the findings. We did all these regressions. The first is that franchisors' strategies do affect the HR practices of franchisees, but in this study, they're limited to the skill, the non-threatening HR. And these practices, as I said, they don't threaten the joint employer status, and they're kind of recognized as needed to run the operations. We also so this confirms anecdotal accounts that size and age matter. So a lot of times people say, McDonald's, they get bigger, they get all standardized, but we don't have any really good studies of that. And so this is a first real confirmation based on a very large data set that not only the franchisors get larger and older, they standardize, but also the franchisees. So you have large brands, but within large and small brands, you also have growing franchisees. So you might think of this as a kind of corporatization of franchise systems as they get older and larger. What we add is that this growth rate matters. So the more aggressive brands are actually there standardizing practices more, and the franchisors among our group, the different brands have different levels of contract termination or different levels of enforcement, and those with stronger use of contract termination clauses get higher compliance with these standardized requirements. And then, not surprisingly, the only factor that increases worker pay is the state minimum wage. So that's kind of a non-finding, but it's an important finding, right? That confirms why it's so important to pursue minimum wage, because we're not going to get it in a voluntary way. However, these specific findings don't rule out other indirect mechanisms. And I think you'll see from Tasha's findings, she's seeing something a little bit different. And so we'll go to her paper after Kate's, and I'll stop there. Okay, so the next paper is going to be Kate's. And do you have slides, right? And you can show them. Okay.
Okay, Rose, can you confirm you can see my slides?
Yes.
All right, let me make sure I can see them. Okay. Okay, so before I start, I just want to thank Wilma and Rose for their leadership with the Russell Sage project and their persistence. And I know, we're still going, but it's been a great experience for me to be involved in this interdisciplinary project. And so I just want to thank you for all that you've been doing. So I'm kind of one of the
slideshow, Kate.
Oh, you can't see it?
I can, but you can also do your slideshow if you prefer. Up to you.
Okay, so you don't see my slideshow because I can see it. Hold on. Let me just try to share again.
We can see your slides, just not in the slideshow format.
Gotcha.
But that's fine. Why don't you just keep going?
Okay, I'll keep
There.
going.
You just need to put it in presenter view, but we can see them fine.
Got it. Thank you, Tosh. Okay, so I know I only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to keep on going here and hopefully people can see it. So these are just the two papers I've been involved in so far from the project. I'm mostly going to be talking about the second paper that is co-authored with Andrew Elmore and is forthcoming in the California Law Review. And the first paper I did focused on kind of the managers and the way that brands and franchisors influence franchisee managers. And the second paper, the one I'll talk about today, it's more about the relationship between franchisors and franchisees and really looking at the power relationship between those two actors and how that can translate into control over the wages and working conditions of the frontline fast food workforce. So the question from the way we phrased it with the Russell Sage project I have here, the broader question driving the research that relates to what I was doing is this: what is the extent of control that franchisors have over franchisees, and what are the mechanisms of control used by franchisors that affect the wages and working conditions of franchisee employees? And so with this question, the approach I took was to, one, just look at how courts are dealing with this question of control, which mostly comes up around joint employer liability and whether the franchisor is also seen as an employer along with the franchisee that has responsibilities under labor and employment law, so how courts were answering that question of control. But we also developed two different sets of data. One was contracts between franchisors and franchisees, and we found contracts that were publicly available for the top, most of the top 50 brands that are quick service or fast food brands. So we had 44 out of the 50. There were 6 that we couldn't find. Either they weren't available publicly or they just don't franchise enough, like Starbucks. But we had 44 and we systematically looked at those contracts. And when we looked at them, we kind of looked for things that courts seem to care about around control, but also the literature. And this is where it was really helpful to have the interdisciplinary input from everybody else on the team. They looked at our coding strategy and put and added some things for us to be looking for systematically in the contracts. And then we also put together a database of documentation that came out of 2 joint employer litigation efforts, one against McDonald's by the National Labor Relations Board and another by Domino's that was a case brought by the New York Attorney General's office. And so we got together all of the documentation there, which was really extensive and helpful. So it was testimony of franchisor representatives, franchisee representatives, emails, communications, manuals, et cetera. And so we put those documents together and also systematically reviewed those under our coding scheme. So for those of you who aren't as enmeshed in the joint employer debate under kind of the legal lens, which is definitely the focus here, we're writing on a law review, I just thought this slide might be useful, and I'm putting things very simply. So lawyers permit me to do so. One is just to when you think about joint employer status, this kind of the easier way to prove it, which is when you have 2 businesses that are involved in the experiences of frontline workers, their working conditions and wages. When the secondary business is directly doing things like they're hiring people or they're disciplining people, their agents are supervising people, then concluding that there's a joint employer responsibility is pretty easy. It's the easier road as I have it here. But that's not where franchising tends to fall. It's in this bumpier road in terms of legal analysis, more related to indirect control. So the secondary business does not directly make a lot of decisions about frontline workers, but they have a strong influence on the nature of the decisions that franchisee representatives are making. And that can be through managers, that can be through other kinds of pressures they're putting on franchisees. And that's an area called indirect control in the law. And that's really where this debate is coming up. And so in this paper, Andrew Elmore and I are arguing that power, the power that franchisors have is an important element that's been underappreciated, and it shapes both the contractual relationship, but also the everyday interactions of franchisors and franchisees. And this power relationship has important impacts on the working conditions of frontline workers that should not be overlooked by courts or executive agencies moving forward. So the quick, I can talk more about this, but the quick lesson here from surveying the litigation on joint employer status is that courts are very resistant to concluding that franchisors, that the brand is a joint employer. So there's lots of indications of this, lots of cases where courts are rejecting complaints against franchisors. It's not exclusively that way. There are some courts that are permitting cases to move forward in the development of a record. So it's not exclusively a foreclosure. But if you were to categorize how the courts are responding, they're pretty resistant to this idea of joint employment in the franchising context and fast food in particular. So just to give you a flavor of what this looks like and how courts talk about it, in this Domino's pizza case, this isn't the Attorney General's case, but it's another case against Domino's. It was a joint employer case. The court said the type of standard setting and oversight exercised by a franchisor does not rise to the requisite level of control to constitute joint employer status. And I use this quote to show that sometimes courts are very categorical. Basically saying franchising is kind of never, as a business model, that kind of oversight is never joint employer status. So they're just resistant to the whole notion of this business model falling into joint employer responsibility. Salazar v. McDonald's is a case that I want to highlight here because this is a situation where a franchisee was using software provided by the franchisor, by McDonald's, the brand, and the software caused a wage and hour violation. And the court there still found that McDonald's, the brand, the franchisor, was not a joint employer, didn't have responsibility over the wage and hour violation, even though they caused it or their software caused it. And so the court says plaintiffs' focus on responsibility for the alleged violations of wage and hour law is misplaced because the question is whether McDonald's is one of the plaintiff's employers, not whether McDonald's caused plaintiff's employer to violate wage and hour laws by giving the employer bad tools or bad advice. So there's lots of examples of that that we have in the paper about this foreclosure and resistance to joint employer status. When we looked at the contracts, and I only have time to go over a couple of things here, we saw a lot of confirmation of what a lot of people say in literature about the one-sidedness of the contract, that franchisors are given a lot of power in the contract, franchisees are given a lot of responsibility in the contract. And so a couple of the terms we wanted to highlight here was termination of the contract and renewal of the contract. Of course, utmost importance to the franchisee who's invested money and time into the enterprise. And so when we looked at termination terms in the contract, you can see the franchisors have the vast majority of power. So 34 of the 44 contracts we reviewed, the franchisor has exclusive power over termination. Now, there could be court cases where the franchisee could challenge that. We're basing this just based on the terms of the contract, the way they're written. But it's certainly the message of the contract is franchisors have the power to terminate, franchisees don't. The 10 that did give franchisees a little bit of power over termination of the contract had a lot of qualifications, like proof of a material breach by the franchisor, et cetera. So it wasn't something easy for the franchisee to do. That said, 10 of them did make it possible for the franchisee to do, again, based on the way the contracts were worded. Renewal of the contract after it expires, 41 of the 44 contracts gave franchisor the exclusive power over this process and over this decision. So certainly the franchisor has, generally speaking, the power over whether to continue this relationship and help the franchisee further these investments it's made in its store or stores. And the other contract terms worth mentioning here is non-compete, right? So restrictions on competitive behavior. 0 of the 44 contracts we reviewed had restrictions on franchisor competitive behavior. They didn't restrict the franchisor in any way. except for some geographical boundaries, which said, franchisor can't open, can't work with someone else to open a store right across the street or within a certain geographical boundary. But beyond that, there were no other restrictions of what kinds of investments or businesses the franchisor could get involved with. 17 of the 44 contracts had restrictions on franchisees during the contract. And so they restricted what kinds of business opportunities the franchisee might have. And then after the contract, a lot of them had some restrictions on franchisee behavior and doing especially any kind of business within, whatever business it is, hamburgers, pizza. And so there'd be a restriction on the franchisee's ability to make good on some of their skills in this area, at least immediately after the end of the contract with the particular brand. Now, contracts are just formalities, so we made sure to look at the documentation from the Domino's and McDonald's cases to look at what the relationship looks like in practice. And we conclude that the power relationship, the dominant franchisor relationship, is very clear in the documentation as well, in the manuals and trainings that are done. And they're trainings that are not just about how to make the hamburger perfectly or how to put the fries in the bag perfectly, but they're also about HR practices, scheduling, where to stand, things that can really affect working conditions beyond just the quality and uniformity of the food that is presented to customers. There was also a lot of monitoring that we saw in the documentation beyond just visits, right? People think, oh, there are not that many in-person visits by franchisors, but there's other kinds of monitoring happening through electronic means, telephonic, web, just email, where the franchisor representatives are in touch regularly with the franchisee about what's happening at a particular store. There's also evaluations, of course, and in those contexts, franchisors are giving directions about how to do everything basically at the store, depending on how things are going. Scheduling tended to be a big one for efficiency's sake, but there are others as well. The evaluations cover the all aspect of the operations, including HR practices. And then this final bullet, I don't have time to give you quotes here, although if people are interested, I can talk about them. But the testimony from franchisees was one of the most interesting and important things we found. Franchisees very much think that the recommendations that franchisors are given are requirements, that they're phrased by the franchisor, and this is strategic for legal reasons, as recommendations about certain working conditions and how to treat their workforce, but they were interpreted as requirements because of these high stakes consequences, business opportunities, termination decisions around contracts. And so time and time again, the franchisees talked about how, well, if the franchisor suggested we discipline one of our employees, we did it because we saw that as a requirement. So the franchisees also tended to see the non-compete restrictions even more broadly than the contracts actually said. So they would say, well, we're not allowed to do any other outside business certainly during the contract. That's not allowed. Has to be our sole business. And that's not what the contract said. They did allow sometimes something beyond pizza or beyond the particular area. So they interpreted them, though, as much more expansive because of this power differential, we think, between the two parties. And then to conclude, sorry, Rose, I'm sure I'm over. I'll just say really quickly that our big take homes in the conclusion of the paper is that power relationships have to be taken more seriously. We're not saying all franchising is joint employer, but that any analysis of the relationship should look at these power relationships and how franchisees are interpreting things and translating them when they're making decisions about wages and working conditions for their frontline employees. Indirect control is something recognized by the law, and these power relationships, we think, impact that and do lead to some avenues of indirect control. And so executive agencies should investigate joint employer liability. They're in a great position to do so in terms of their resources rather than individual plaintiffs who might just not know kind of all the intricacies, but the investigation can unearth things that are realities of joint employer and control. And then also, you know, as much as we can impact courts, we call for the end of courts just dismissing these cases out of hand. Hear the cases, develop the record. And some of these brands are joint employers, but we can only see that once we look really in a detailed fashion at the relationship between franchisor and franchisees. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to move on. That was excellent. Thank you, Kate. And if you can take down your share, we're going to get Tosh up. And Tosh is building on the first paper that Kate did that Kate didn't have time to talk about. So you'll see the relationships among the different papers as we go through these. Yes, Tosh, and I will wave at you if, let's try to get us through in about 8 minutes because we have
Gotcha.
Well.
Yeah, I have my timer. I'm going to set it, and I will try to stick to the 8-minute time limit. Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? Yes, great. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Tashlin. You can call me Tash. So today we're really excited to be here to present a very new study that looks at how franchisors affect pay and working conditions in franchise units. And we are providing evidence from the fast food industry, in fact, from the same survey that Rose presented from. So to get started, let me see if I can click. Okay, so I'm not going to go over what is franchising and why is it important. I think Rose has done that justice and what the franchise business model is. So let's get right into it. So how can franchisor HR policies and guidance affect working conditions? So let's take a step back and understand what do HR practices look like in franchises? Well, we know from previous research that pay and working conditions are lower in franchisee owned operations compared to franchisor owned operations. So research has demonstrated that franchisee owned operations have lower compensation, lower labor standards compliance, and lower investments in HR practices compared to company owned operations. And a lot of this seems to be coming from the franchisee profit motive in which they get to keep the residual profits of their operations. And so they have an incentive to reduce labor costs, which means reducing investments in HR practices. But franchisors can directly affect working conditions in franchisees via guidance. So franchisors often provide guidance that becomes standardized or routine. And Kate talked a little bit about some of this guidance, particularly with regards to HR practices. In a recent paper that I co-authored with Ken, who was on the first paper, and that is conditionally accepted at Organization Science, we show that when franchisors provide organizational routines or standards for workforce management, franchisee-owned operations are more likely to adopt HR practices associated with that guidance. And one way that franchisors can provide that guidance to franchisees is potentially through brand requirements that require compliance with those standards. And an example of this is Subway, where Subway provided its franchisees with training and monitoring to improve compliance with wage and hour laws. So in addition to franchisors' potentially direct influence on frontline worker HR practices or working conditions, franchisors may also indirectly affect the treatment of frontline workers through policies for unit managers. So to start, franchisees are often creating HR policies and practices for their managers to facilitate compliance with brand requirements. And as Kate shows in not the paper that she presented today, but the one that she talked about at the very beginning, Kate theorizes and shows through contractual analyses that franchisors may also directly influence franchisee managers and the HR practices of managers, for example, by setting out training, hiring, firing qualifications of those managers. And so they can also directly affect unit managers who then in turn implement or influence frontline employees as they implement HR practices for them. So Kate will recognize this model because we adapted it from her paper. So and hopefully I'm doing this justice, Kate, but Kate theorizes that franchisors have a stronger influence on managers who then influence frontline employees, so that franchisors may have an indirect influence on frontline worker HR practices through their treatment or through their management of franchisee managers. And so in today's study, what we're doing is actually testing this model using data from our franchisee survey. So first, we're going to look at whether franchisors have a direct influence on frontline workers and how brand requirements directly affect the HR practices of frontline workers. And then we'll also look at whether franchisors have a direct effect on the HR practices of managers, and then in turn, whether franchisee managers influence frontline workers. And the way we do this, again, is through that national survey of franchisees in the fast food industry. And we look at how brand requirements from the franchisor influence the HR practices of managers and of workers. And so we look at three main types of franchisor brand requirements. The first is franchisor training. So this is the days of training provided to the franchisee each year. We also look at franchisor HR evaluation. So we look at whether performance evaluations are based on meeting franchisor objectives for labor productivity, staff performance, staff training, and labor costs. And then we look at franchisor HR technology, and that's whether franchisors require franchisees to use technology for workforce management. So that includes payroll, recruitment and hiring, staff training, and time and attendance software. And for the purposes of today's presentation, we combine all of these into an overall brand standards or brand requirement index. But it's important to note that we've also evaluated the effect of each of these as separately as well. But for the sake of time, we'll just present the overall results. And we look at the effect of these brand requirements on both manager HR practices, so that's training and pay and benefits, and on worker HR practices. So that includes selection and training. So those are those skill enhancing HR practices that Rose mentioned that enhance the skills and abilities of workers. Pay and benefits that often we refer to as motivation enhancing HR practices that motivate or incentivize workers to put forth effort. And then we also look at a third dimension of the HR system, and that's employee discretion, which we often refer to as opportunity enhancing HR practices that really get at whether workers have a say over how they perform their jobs. And all of these models include controls for franchisee characteristics, manager characteristics, restaurant and local unit, local market characteristics, including minimum wages, unemployment rates, region, and restaurant, age, size, location, all of that. So what do we find when we look at manager HR practices? I won't spend a lot of time on the numbers, but we do find that brand requirements affect manager HR practices. Brand requirements are positively associated with manager training and positively associated with pay and benefits, manager pay and benefits. What do we find when we look at frontline worker HR practices? We find very similarly that franchisor brand requirements also have or also affect frontline worker HR practices. They're positively associated with selection and training and not really associated with pay and benefits directly, but negatively associated with worker discretion. And I should mention this is consistent with our findings in that paper I mentioned that's forthcoming, where we theorize that strong organizational routines and standards regarding work design really limit workers' abilities to have discretion or a say over how they perform their jobs. What's also interesting is that we also find that manager HR practices significantly affect the HR practices of frontline workers. So manager HR practices are positively associated with worker selection and training, positively associated with worker pay and benefits, and similar to franchisor influence, negatively associated with worker discretion. So putting it all together, coming right back to this model that I put up at the beginning, what are we finding? We're finding that franchisors do have a direct effect on workers through their brand requirements. We also find that franchisors have a direct effect in terms of their brand requirements on manager HR practices. And coming to the question of whether franchise managers have an indirect or whether brand requirements have an indirect effect on frontline workers through unit managers, we do find significant indirect effects of franchisor influence on frontline workers through unit managers. So a positive effect on selection and training, a positive effect on pay and benefits, and a negative effect on employee discretion. So the major takeaway here is that brand requirements affect the HR practices of managers, who in turn appear to manage workers in accordance with franchise standards. So really quickly to summarize, this is my last slide. This study shows that franchisors have a strong influence on how franchisees manage their workforce, and this occurs through franchisor brand requirements. Franchisees create HR practices for managers and workers in line with those brand requirements. And in this study, we suggest that there may be a causal link between the HR practices of managers and how they in turn manage frontline workers, but this relationship requires further investigation to really understand how managers and manager HR practices are related to worker HR practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tosh. And now I'm going to turn to Lance Compa, who is going to report to us on a wonderful study that he and Tony Royle have been doing on the McDonald's Corporation around the world.
Okay, okay, let me jump right in. First of all, a disclaimer that this is a work in progress. We have a paper, but it's not ready for prime time. I'd be happy to send it to anybody who requests it, you know, for your own use, and happy to get comments as well. But we're still at it. I'm working with Tony Royle in the UK, and we're looking at collective bargaining models that McDonald's engages in around the world. The CEO of McDonald's in the 80s and 90s, he was the CEO for about 10 years. He flat out said, I think in 1995, McDonald's is a non-union company and intends to stay that way. Well, in most of the world, McDonald's is not a non-union company. In much of the world, 100% of the non-management employees in McDonald's restaurants are union represented. Now, the nature and the quality of that union representation varies greatly from country to country. So I don't want to be, you know, too idealistic about this. But there's plenty of evidence that, especially in Northern Europe, that you know, the union representation leads to McDonald's jobs actually being very good jobs. You know, wages at $18 or $20 an hour, and of course they have national health insurance system, so they don't have to worry about that sort of thing. But they're considered good jobs. We looked at, in Europe, we looked at Sweden, Italy, and Spain. And in Latin America, we're looking at Mexico and Brazil. Again, the structure of the collective bargaining system in each of those countries is quite different. I'm not going to have time to get into the fine distinctions in each country, but I think the important point I want to get across is that McDonald's corporate officials in all of these countries participate in collective bargaining, enter into collective bargaining negotiations and agreements on behalf of themselves as corporate-owned, for their corporate-owned stores, but also on behalf of their franchisees. In many cases, the McDonald's corporate managers and representatives of the franchisees are at the bargaining table and reach these collective bargaining agreements. And it's totally unrelated to the question of joint employer status. In fact, in most countries, the courts have taken the same kind of position that they take here. So in unfair dismissal cases or workplace injury cases, McDonald's corporate is not taken to be a joint employer. The franchisee, the franchise owner is responsible for those things. But that doesn't prevent McDonald's from bargaining collectively on behalf of itself and of its franchisees in these different countries that we're looking at. Sometimes it's a direct across the table bargaining in Mexico, for example. Sometimes it's pursuant to McDonald's being part of an employer association that negotiates a sector-wide agreement for the restaurant sector or the fast food sector that covers both McDonald's stores and the franchisees. But I think the bottom line, and let me get to the bottom line because I'm really eager to hear from Mary Joyce and anybody else. So I was going to get into some of the fine distinctions in each country, but let's move on. The bottom line is that McDonald's can bargain collectively for itself and its franchisees, either where it's required to do so by law, which is the system in many European countries, or where it chooses to do so. And in Mexico, for example, McDonald's chose to do so. The problem is the union in Mexico is what we call a protection union. The union was actually invited in by McDonald's. The whole thing was brokered by the Baker and McKenzie law firm office in Mexico City. You know, when McDonald's entered Mexico, they said, look, this is the union that you want because this union won't give you any trouble. And that's the union with which McDonald's corporate and its franchisees together negotiate collective bargaining agreements. If we transpose these, structures to the United States, nothing in U.S. labor law. Again, we set aside the joint employer question. McDonald's can bargain collectively for itself and its franchisees if it chooses to do so, or if the law requires it. Maybe in the United States, if proposals for sectoral bargaining and some of the wage board experiments that are taking place around the country, maybe that can lead to some legal structure in which McDonald's bargains collectively with unions in the United States. Or McDonald's could choose to do so because strategically it decides that it's better to engage with worker representatives than to maintain the intention to stay non-union. I hope that our paper, once it's finalized, will reflect some of these things and provide further lessons for how things might evolve here in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lance. And as you see, all of our papers are work in progress, and we look forward to comments. Let's start with Mary Jo Carlson. Thank you so much for being here, and then we'll turn to John Gordon. We have a stop date time of, we have 16 minutes. But we can run over a little bit if people do want to stay on. So Mary Joyce, thank you for being here. You need to unmute.
Okay, thanks to everyone for all this very helpful and useful study and analysis. I have been particularly interested in the global situation from the beginning of the Fight for 15 campaign, and in fact approached the management lawyer at the outset of the 180-day NLRB proceeding that we had on this issue and said, why can't we have a system in the United States like you have in Australia, where you come to a bargaining table with, with the franchisees, you collect them, and we reach an agreement on a lot of these things. And, he said, well, that's possible in Australia, but it's not possible here. And I think it is possible here if there's a will to do it, but there's not, there's not the will to do it. This is all very interesting to me. The system I understand best is McDonald's. And the way I look at McDonald's is that it is a system of systems. And if there is a national problem, for example, a pandemic, the only entity in that system that is in relationship with every other entity in the system is the franchisor. So the only way there could be a united, and fast food workers were considered to be essential workers during the pandemic. They were without, we had strike after strike after strike in California, in Illinois, and Florida, because there was a lack of protective equipment and PPO. There was no policy around testing. There was no policy around disclosure if another employee was infected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, I think, and there were many, many complaints, in excess of 150, as I recall, that were filed with OSHA, were filed with the California OSH, and so on and so forth. So eventually, McDonald's began to put out some standards on what COVID compliance should look like in the franchisees. The other place that we see this is in, we have mounted a very vigorous campaign globally, challenging gender-based violence in the workplace. because sexual harassment in restaurants in general and in fast food in particular is it's really it's at a very high level. And so we've campaigned on this. We had a historic strike on this issue, the first one that had happened in 100 years. We have filed multiple charges with the EEOC. We filed charges with state agencies. We're in federal court on some of these cases, and we have an OECD complaint that we filed around challenging the problem under OECD guidelines. And again, the notion that the only entity in this system, McDonald's system, that can really intervene, make an intervention to change the culture of the workplace is the franchisor. It's McDonald's. And McDonald's itself has recognized that by promulgating what it calls global brand standards or expectations with regard to the prevention of sexual harassment. And so I believe that in these two recent incidents, the COVID and the sexual harassment, that McDonald's itself has to walk toward accepting responsibility, accepting, society demands it, accepting, the liability, the responsibility for changing conditions in the workplaces for its workers. Now, sometimes I wish I'd never heard of this concept, joint employer, because it's really about how are you going to be responsible and who's going to be responsible for producing a workplace that's conducive to good treatment of employees, meeting your sales goals, because ultimately that's what McDonald's wants to do. I want to mention one other thing with regard to the franchise model with McDonald's. In addition to paying royalties, they also pay rent. McDonald's owns all the property that its franchisees operate on. So that is another drain on the franchisee in terms of their profits. So where does that leave them? That leaves them that if they're going to make money, labor cost is really the variable that's available to them to make money from. And that in and of itself is a pressure. I just want to say something about, the only way the wages can get raised is through a change in the minimum wage. I think there's an additional factor now, and that's the labor shortage. Because what we see is that there are rising wages in response to the labor shortage. But the interesting part about the minimum wage to me is that while other corporations, Target recently, Costco, Wells Fargo, have announced that they're going to 15, McDonald's has not announced that. The first announcement that they made was that they would no longer oppose the federal increase in wages to $15 an hour. But they did not, so I don't know what they had ever done to do that, but who lobbied against it the most strongly was the International Franchising Association and the National Restaurant Association. So McDonald's, and the point I'm making with this is that the franchisor, if you have a political solution to the wage problem, they work in a way to affect that through associations. So they are involved in setting wages through their lobbying work, through their political work, and so on and so forth. Recently, they announced that they would go to 15 in the corporate-owned stores, not in the franchisee stores, but in the corporate-owned stores. And frankly, I'm not sure that that's happened. Of course, they have gone to 15 in places that require it, like California, Illinois, Maryland, all the states that have passed the $15 an hour. The final thing that I want to talk about, that I want to mention, is the anti-competition aspect of this. We supported a case by the Italian Consumer Association at the European Commission challenging anti-competitive behavior between the franchisor, McDonald's the franchisor, and its franchisees in France, Germany, and Italy. And the commission ultimately sent that case back to the individual countries. And right now the case is pending in Italy, and the Consumer Association has been joined by about 7 franchisees. And they have given very interesting statements that relate to price fixing and relate to the central complaint, which is the abuse of dominant position. This goes to Kate's point that regulatory agencies need to look at the power relationship. Well, of course, under anti-competition law, that's exactly what you look at. You look at, you know, who's got the dominant position, who's got the inferior position. And we're watching this case in Italy very, very closely because I think that there is a good possibility that the authority is going to move on both the price fixing and the abuse of dominant position. Now that's in Europe, that's not here. But I will say that here, the agency that's responsible for the franchisor-franchisee contract is the Federal Trade Commission. And they've not looked at these contracts or examined these contracts or taken a hard look at them. And I think it's really 15 years since they've been looked at. And so that's another place that we'd like to see some activity in.
I'm going to have to move on to John, so we leave a little bit of room for him. But thank you so much, Mary Joyce, for those insights that really get us to the global level. That's fabulous. John Gordon is a longtime research and consultant in the restaurant industry, and he has some comments for us, I believe. Let's see if we can get John on.
Hello, good afternoon. So yes, longtime restaurant analyst and management consultant. And yes, I've worked for franchisees and franchisors, and I've actually done some joint employer work, and I understand this issue and franchisor issues very well. So I agree with much of what Mary has had to say. And all of the papers this afternoon have been great, and I agree with them. I will say some comments to help build upon them. One is that I agree upon the notion about direct and indirect control. Most of the control is said to be indirect, but I will tell you there's a surprising amount of the intent of the control is to be indirect, but I will tell you there is an awful lot of direct control that surfaces. I will note to my team members that I circulated some rather direct control just last night to Rose and my team members. So you would be surprised what it has to say, but it really does happen. Okay, very, very direct control. I want to note that essentially the QSR industry, grew up after World War II with the birth of the interstate system. It grew up after with the command and control nature coming out of World War II, and the fact that everything needs to look the same, and that's how the original franchise agreements were structured. They were structured with a bunch of attorneys that all kind of gathered together, and they made franchise agreements all look the same. And there's now a group of franchisor attorneys that have copied one another year after year after decade, and that's why the franchise agreements are really contracts of adhesion in most cases. They are very tough. They are very, very difficult for franchisees. And the study results actually show that. They are extremely difficult for entrepreneurs and others coming in. Franchising spread because it was quote unquote asset light. It was profitable. Ray Kroc got started in franchising, very early, and then that word spread, pretty quickly. I want to say that in conclusion to one of Kate's hopes is that while the language of joint employer right now is embedded in code and decisions, and the like, I will guarantee you right now that there will be investigations from government bodies. Elections have consequences, friends, and I guarantee you there will be investigations. There are fun things happening right now. Okay, I want to go on and mention more about the mindset of a franchisor. A mindset of the franchisor is that they have different mindsets in terms of command and control. They have different mindsets in terms of how much general and administrative expense that they actually have, flexibility in their economic model. A franchisor like McDonald's, and yeah, we'll talk about McDonald's a lot. We've already talked a lot about it today, but they were one of the original franchisors. Fred Turner, the senior chair of McDonald's, who actually created the first operations manual when he was Ray Kroc's grill man, and so he's very instructive. But they have always had a lot of G&A. They have a lot of inspectors running around, in other words. So they are closest to a real joint employer, really. Okay, they really are. In terms of the depths of their operations manuals, in terms of their inspections, in terms of their annual requirements and the like. You can argue on the edges in terms of, well, did they do this? Did they do that? And I mean the judges' rulings, of course, are so noted. Okay, but in looking across the transom, there's an awful lot of control in that particular system. You have to realize why the franchisor actually sets these controls apart, and not every franchisor though has the same amount of control requirements and the like. So that has to be kept in mind. I want to be brief. I know our time is tight. I do want to talk a little bit about joint employerisms in general. Joint employer goes, at least in my research, all the way back to 1968. Joint employer, Speedy 7-Eleven at the time. That's where I first started reading about it. And so Mary began talking about the IFA, International Franchise Association. So the IFA is a very active pro-franchisor lobby and political action group. Okay. They say they represent franchisees, but they don't. Okay. They support McDonald's and many other franchisors. And in 2015, there was, in the second Obama administration, there was more activity, on the activity coming out of the Labor Department, and the great fear of joint employer was born. Okay. And it became I want to stress that it became a political rallying cry and a fundraising effort, actually, on the part of the International Franchise Association. And they cooked up silly studies, some of which that I actually debunked on a website, and they used it as a political wedge. And really, in my view, joint employer always is and always will be a case-by-case decision tree. In terms of did particular conditions occur at a particular employer, and it's not a case-by-case situation. And one of the experts employed by the IFA indicated, even in the last couple of years, that wow, there's a $50 billion negative impact coming to the franchise industry due to joint employer or some such, and that's just bizarre beyond belief. So.
So John, I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute. Our session does end at 2:30, unfortunately, and we've packed in our time.
I'm done. I appreciate the
Okay.
opportunity to chat.
But if people, I think we can stay on for a few more minutes. There's another session that starts at 2:45. Clearly, there is a lot to talk about in this world, and we really appreciate everyone hanging in. Thank you so much, John and Mary Joyce and the speakers. And if Wilma is still on, again, she's the one who really got us going, and we thank her so much. I gave you a shout out at the beginning, Wilma, but you weren't here.
I had trouble connecting. Thank you.
If there's some more conversation, we can hang out for a few more minutes, but excellent comments from the discussant. I wish we could hear you for another half hour or more.
So thanks to all of you. I had some trouble connecting, but I'm really pleased to see all of you again, and so glad the conversation is still going on. Really appreciate it.
And we'll probably be here next year with another round of updates.
Hopefully we finally get the census data.
Right.
We're used to meeting for 5 hours, so we're not used to being on shorter timelines.
Nice to see all of you, see all your faces.
Yeah,
So,
great.
thanks very much.
Well, I hate to shut this down, but I do want to just emphasize how informative Mary Joyce and John are, because, as we get into our data and into our legal cases and into the weeds, real world people who are out there all the time kind of bring us out of it and inform us in ways that are so helpful. And we need to have more of this dialogue, and hopefully, with perhaps the movement out of the pandemic period, we can have more face-to-face conversations and more collaboration along these lines. So thank you all so much. And if you want to linger a bit, I'm going to be right here. So John and Mary Joyce, it is great to see you. And I'm amazed at the work you continue to do.
Well, likewise, Rose, thank you for, and Wilma, thank you for shepherding this for so long. This has been a great process.
Well, I really think this year, finally, we're going to see, Kate has been churning out some work, but these multi-year projects with so many parts and data do really take long to come to fruition, where we really kind of figure out what the academic or empirical story is. And it can be frustrating to people like you all who continue your work in everyday fights, but hopefully we do inform you as we go forward.
And
Do we have
congrats to Kate and Tash and Lance for actually doing the work,
Do we have a sense of when the economists might be able to get enough access to their data? Because that'll be really interesting for them when they're ready to present.
Yeah, so that it's been so frustrating. For those of you still here, there's the big gold standard study is that we have access to census data, the economic census that clearly identifies franchisor and franchisees, and we are matching that to real national wage data to give us the gold standard study of how much franchisees underpay their workers. Unfortunately, it was held up during the pandemic because they couldn't go to the place. They have to go to a specific research center to get access to the data because it's government sensitive data. They're getting access now, but in the meantime, one of my economists had a baby and the other one is doing work at the OECD. So I've got to corral them back so that they can get to work on my data. And I'm determined to make sure it happens, but it'll happen. Hopefully by next year, we'll have that study, and ours will be a lot cleaner because we're just grappling through the data now. And it looks like another session is beginning to come on, so we may have to remove ourselves. But thank you so much. And
Thank you all.
we will be more in touch.
Thanks, good to see
Thanks, Rose,
everybody.
for organizing.
Likewise, thank you.
Session.
Thanks, Rose.
Also, Rose, it still shows as recording, so you might want to hit stop recording on that.
Yes, thank you. I will do so right now.